Hi, I'm Author Assist, proud sponsor of the 3-Act Structure Show on the GoIndieNow platform. Author Assist offers affordable services and one-on-one training to independent authors. I help them from brainstorming an idea to publishing and the promotion and marketing of the book. I have 2 podcasts, Narrations by KK and Behind the Pen. I'm the host of the radio show Author Assist on the Artist First Radio Network, and I'm also a multi-award-winning filmmaker. Love creating book trailers. I'm also a graphic designer and offer at least another 20 services that will help authors navigate and stand out. If you're a new author and you're holding the copy of your book in your hands, thinking, now what? That's when you need Author Assist. Contact me for a service sheet at kgantusauthораssist@gmail.com.
When we deconstruct the elements of story and its structure, whether you acknowledge 3 acts or not, our focus shifts to one aspect that connects us all: the characters. Since the dawn of storytelling itself, there has always been one side's hero and one side's villain. Now, where you may fall in who you support or relate to might shift, but it's always there. However, these days, it's even more layered and complicated. When we have been able to nuance and finite roles and involvement, gray the black and white. It's that examination we will be doing this season. And we'll be doing it in 3-act structure.
In this episode, we say hello to the bad guy as we take a trip to the dark side and conjure up all those fears and emotions to assume the role of the antagonist.
I write as J.E. Taylor. I write paranormal suspense, and I also do a podcast on Saturday nights, Spilling Ink. I just finished 63rd book.
I'm Anita Stewart. I write under AF Stewart, and I write all things dark and stabby. Horror, fantasy, poetry. I've got several books out, a trilogy, some anthologies, and there's more to come this year, hopefully. So.
I'm David Green. I do a podcast. I write. I have 2 series. I have a epic dark fantasy series called Empire of Ruin, which the first book is out and the second book is on its way out. I'm actually reading it at the moment, and I'm like, this is not so bad. This is quite surprising. I like it. I read like the first 10 chapters today, and I was like, you know what? I would continue reading this if I didn't have to. And I have a urban fantasy series, which is called the first one is called The Devil Walks in Blood, which is the 2 books combined, and it's people say it's kind of like the Dresden Files, a little bit like Supernatural, Hellblazer, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I do.
Hi, I'm Julie Hiner. I just write as Julie Hiner. I'm actually working on book 3 in my 80s metal murder series. So my crime novels are very dark serial killer like Seven and Silence of the Lambs. My horror is actually not that far because all you do is take away the details of the investigation of the criminal profiling and create whatever you want. But I tend to continue to base these characters on serial killers. And I love the 80s, the old school vibe, and I love music. So a lot of what I do is infused with both music and all things from 70s, 80s, 90s.
So where do we start when we're building our antagonist? What is the first thing you do when you're building your antagonist?
All my antagonists have the same root. When I was in college, I was an intern at a news station, and they had me sitting in a murder trial. And this guy had killed a woman and, dragged her out of a garage and did awful things to her. Anyway, I saw him daily. And yes, he was found guilty and he was given the death penalty. So this was all the death penalty deliberation. So, you got to hear all the awful things. Every villain I have has a piece of this man in him, and he had like no soul. And when he looked at you, it was just like empty. That's where the basis starts. And then you have to layer on top of that. Seeing somebody and seeing just the vacant look in their eyes was just scary as hell.
Yeah, I think my villains begin with what they want. That's the first thing I think about, is what do the villains want and how do they get it and how far they'll go to get it. So that's basically where I start with my villains.
I'm not too far from Jane, I think, because, well, actually both of what you said. I do start with, I have a model that I've built based on real serial killers. So I'm after the Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper, Robert Pickton type. So I have a model of the elements that compose that person, because my books are as equally point of view bad guy as good guy, and it's questionable who's good and bad at sometimes. And I'm actually really fascinated with understanding the serial killer. So I show the brokenness and actually create some empathy for this person who can't stop doing what they're doing. So I start with real cases, but I do actually do just as much for my serial killers of what are their needs, their wants, their desires, why are they the way they are. So I do a full character development and represent them just as much as the quote unquote good guy in the book.
I kind of come at from the story and then the kind of protagonist's point of view, and it is basically what is the most challenging thing that I can put in front of the protagonists. And obviously it's dark fantasy and it's kind of urban fantasy, so there is obviously that grey area as well. So like as Julie was saying, that the protagonists also do have their weaknesses and have their bad sides and their dark sides as well. And the antagonists are not often, well, they don't consider themselves as villains, although some of them may well do and be like, well, what I do is necessary to achieve this goal. But yeah, it's generally from that point of view. It's like, I have this setup, I have this story, I have this character. How can I make their life and their journey as challenging and as hard as possible? So then I construct the main antagonist then to be their complete foils in that kind of way. But then I'll do the same thing for the antagonist as well. Then I'll find counterpoints for them where I can say, well, what are their weaknesses? What are their fears? What would challenge them as well? Because I do like to check in with the villains every so often. And this book I'm working on at the moment, there's quite a lot of the POV is from one of the antagonists from the first book, who is going on a little bit of a journey himself and questioning quite a few things. And that's quite fun because he's kind of going on the descent of madness as well. And he's not a very nice person at all. And it's kind of surprising the places that you do go to. But once you kind of do that routine where you can, have what is their biggest fear, what is their biggest challenge, what can you do to make their life as difficult as possible, it's good to kind of explore those kind of things and you get a really rounded character.
So oftentimes, and Julie, you mentioned this, you're trying to, and David, you also touched on this a little bit, which is the idea that the antagonist and protagonist almost parallel each other in certain aspects where you're trying to define them, but they may not be all good, all bad. They may have moments of gray, and you may not know who the antagonists and protagonists are right off the bat. Mm-hmm. So what do you use most in defining the antagonist then? What is it that you use to differentiate them? Is it their look? Is it the morality of what they're doing and their motivation? Or is it something else? Where do you find the line and change it so that it's the antagonist, they become the antagonist?
It's a mixture of things, and it depends on what kind of one you want to do. I mean, you can do that mustache twirling bad guy who loves to be bad, and they love it and they revel in it, and that's fun to do sometimes, and it's great to have someone like that as well. But if you do want to get one that's a little bit more nuanced, I think especially when you're exploring kind of like what I do with dark fantasy and stuff, where I'm more in towards grim dark fantasy, which is very much like people are just people and they're capable of good and bad, is that the actual antagonists, when they approach like a line or a crossroad and they make that conscious decision to do something terrible, they don't give themselves excuses about it. It's just like, well, this is what I have to do, and I am going to live with this, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. Basically, they make that choice. Whereas if you're on the other side and you're the protagonist, there is more of that struggle where it's like there is this moral dilemma that they have, and sometimes they may have to cross the line, what they don't want to do, but then you have to kind of show that journey of regret and remorse, which you don't really have to do as much with the antagonist. But again, it depends on what type of antagonist you want to do. You might want to do an antagonist who is beset by guilt and remorse and all this kind of stuff about their actions.
Yeah, my bad guys usually have the moral low ground. Versus the protagonist that has the moral high ground. But in some cases there are gray areas, as you said, and the gray characters that are supposed to be good, that walk on the line, are fun too. But the dark characters that want to try to do good are just as fun as those protagonists too. So or think they want to do good. That they're the hero of their story, as you so often hear.
Yeah, my characters tend to be a little more morally ambiguous, both the protagonist and the antagonist. Mm-hmm. But I think motivation is what separates them, because my antagonists tend to be more self-motivated, selfish goals, selfish gains, mm-hmm. or hubris. They have a lot of hubris. Whereas the protagonists tend to be more of a guardian, sort of protective motivation in what they do. But yeah, they're not always the great people either.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's a little different for me, because ultimately when the reader figures out for sure who's killing people, I mean, that's never okay. But in some of the stories I've written, I've had readers really get attached to the killer, because I started by introducing them to the abuse that he or she went through, and what it was like for them, and how they became who they were, and how they're struggling with it. And then likewise with my poor detective, who just, things get worse and worse and worse. The thing is, in reality, I've done interviews, and in reality, it just does get worse and worse and worse. And what happens is, it is like the Netflix version of Hannibal, where the detective is just suffering PTSD and sees hallucinations all the time, or things like that, and they do begin to break down, and they do begin to do things that they're not supposed to do. But at the same time, the reader or the person who's watching whatever, they buy into it because they see how horrible this is and how difficult it is. So I think, like, I have both of them, both the good guys and bad guys, quote unquote, doing good and bad things. But ultimately, I think a reader is going to more with a detective than a serial killer. Now, when I write pure horror and people don't actually know those characters are based on real human monsters, again, you can really pull the reader into care about this character before they do these really bad things. And the readers may never know that those characters are based on real people.
Has the way you write villains changed over time as you find it? Do you stay to a core idea with writing an antagonist, or do you feel like, especially in a series where you have a recurring character, or you're doing, I mean, for you, Julie, you have a detective that's the core character and he's solving different crimes throughout, but I mean, there's common threads and everything like that, but do you change anything when as you write it?
Well, I think it evolves for me, because I've heard some people here say they look at the character and who they are. So I've got a series, and in one of them, the serial killer kind of becomes the victim of the person who abused him. And so now I've got a worse serial killer, and then I've got one that sort of becomes the victim. So I think it really depends on the story and the specific character. I don't think I write them exactly the same way. I might have sort of fundamental things I start with.
Is it something you're conscious of, or is it something that It's just inherent with what you're doing.
I think it happens as I get to know the character and they tell me who they are. It just happens. Their uniqueness comes out, and they're going to have similar attributes, but they're not all going to be the same.
I think my villains adapt to the story, but there are certain like extremes that are in common, because most of my villains will go to very bad extremes in the stories if they have to. So that sort of willingness to go beyond what most people would consider acceptable behavior is basically what they have in common, I think.
Yeah, I try and do something a little bit different with each book that I do with the villains. And obviously in some series, some of them carry over, but then I try to put them on different journeys if they survive one of the books, which they might not do. But in terms of challenges and what have you, and develop them more and get to know this character a little bit more as well, because it is fascinating to find out what it is that drives these people and what, like Jane said before, a lot of the villains, and it is a bit of a cliche, but it is true. For a villain, a lot of time they are, the hero of their story. That the reasons they're doing things are they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do, whatever it is they're doing. So it's good to kind of shine a bit of a light on that and sometimes prove them right. This thing that they're taking these terrible actions for to protect like their piece of land against, or their whatever it is, comes true, and they're like, well, if I warned you all, and that can be fun to do as well. In my other series, which is like urban fantasy, it's like a detective, so it's like a mystery kind of thing, so that the villains will change in that one. There is an overarching story that has different people that come back into it quite often, but for the actual kind of case that's going on, there would be a different antagonist each time, and again try and do something a little bit different with those ones, like people from different backgrounds, or maybe surprise kind of twist at the end where the villain that you thought was going to be the villain actually isn't, or whatever. But again, I take the same kind of approach where it's like, these are the characters that I want to explore in this story, and what is the biggest challenge for them, and then bring it from there. But it is a conscious decision to try and do something a little bit different each time.
Yeah, I've kind of evolved. I've got to think about this a little bit. My first bad guy in my first series was really quite bad. He really had no redeeming qualities. And then, yeah, he really didn't. So his end was like, cheered on. But in my FBI series, in the second book, my favorite antagonist was actually, people liked him. He was a drug kingpin, and that the FBI agent was supposed to take down. So it was really fun to write it where he was a likable character in some ways, but abhorrent in the way he treated people and went about business as usual. So, and then my latest, the one that's coming out in April, my antagonist loves the protagonist. So it's a very complicated.
Layers upon layers upon layers. That's how it should be, right? What is the funnest thing for you about exploring that? I mean, no judgment here, okay? We're writers, everybody out there, we're writers, so there is no action involved in this. It's purely all just for fun. So what is the funnest thing about writing a villain for you guys?
The stabby bits.
the wrongness of the things they do.
It's like how far you can push it, right?
Yep.
Just like I use beta readers quite a lot, and there's a few scenes in this book that I just finished working on where the beta reader's been like, this guy is sick. Like, how have you up with this, and it's like,
Mhm.
this is good. This is good. I like to hear this.
Everybody's like, "You're such a sweet person. What the hell?"
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's like,
Yeah. You tell people about your story and they're giving you looks.
yeah. Like, people are like, you're quite laid back and you're quite pleasant to deal with, but then you have this character who's doing this. Like, where does that come from? It's like, well, this is
Exactly.
that I don't let anyone else see, but I can channel through this guy, right? And it's quite liberating sometimes, isn't
Oh
it?
yes. There's plenty of people at work that are alive because I write.
Right? You're teaching people how to not get murdered. I mean,
Yes.
I love what David said about channeling, and because I literally feel like, I mean, I'm so addicted to true crime, and you can literally be someone else. And it's amazing how, like, you can get so lost in being this terrible, dark character, and it's okay, it's acceptable because you're just writing. And then you go back and read it and you think, oh my God, like, I wrote that? Geez, like, because I know what you guys are saying. You have people react to this and they're like, you wrote this. I'm like, yeah, that's, but it's a good outlet for, like, also personal, like, if you're anxious or nervous or dramatic, or like my own emotional problems, I channeled into these characters. I went through journals from when I was younger and I'm in a much better place now, and just channeled how that felt. And it's actually pretty therapeutic because it's all in a make-believe world, right? So it's okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I have I have been diagnosed with general anxiety disorder since I was a teenager, and it's like, sometimes it's okay and it's just there in the background, and other times it's quite bad and it's quite difficult to live with. So one of the villains that I've been working on recently, I was like, I've never really written about this very much, or I've written about it, people suffering from this kind of stuff from a more of a positive way where they can kind of try and deal with it. But I was like, what about someone who's repressed this for so long, and it's just coming out of them in these kind of ways that is just really and they're taking out on other people, and it's just twisting them. And I was like, what, I'm gonna try and do that with this character in this book. And it was great for me to actually do that, because it was great for me to kind of think about those times where I felt, especially in my 20s, I suppose, or my early 20s, when I was like, I was supposed to be a functioning adult and doing functioning adult kind of things, and I had this thing that I was living with, and I was kind of thinking about that and putting a lot of that into it. And it was great to kind of explore it, and kind of like, it's quite therapeutic in a way to kind of deal with this thing that I'd never really talked to people about, and these thoughts that I'd have at that period of my life and everything, and say, well, if I didn't get the help, or I didn't get the thing that I had, what could have happened to me in this situation? And it was, I felt a lot better after writing this character and writing this character arc in this time. But I obviously pushed it a lot further than what the reality was, because it's like, that's what you do when people were reacting to this character and everything from the beta readers, and they're like, where is this coming from? And it's like, well,
most people would think writing an antagonist involves some kind of anger. Do you feel like that's misrepresented? Do you feel like there's another emotion that you prey on when you're working out an antagonist?
Yeah, I think fear is the biggest one.
Yeah.
I think anger is definitely one of them, and like, as Yoda says, fear leads to anger, and he was very right about that. But I think fear is at the base thing for a lot of antagonists. It's that fear of not having control over a situation or themselves, fear of losing something, fear of confronting themselves and confronting the weakness inside of themselves. But again, you'd look at that with protagonists as well, and fear is something that drives them as well, but it drives them to do something better.
For me, there's something they're really trying to get. Like, I have one character that he's struggling with his sexuality, and he's been abused, so he's really anxious, he's really nervous, and anger comes later when he's getting really frustrated, but it's not really what drives any of my characters.
I think greed can be a factor as well to drive some of the antagonists, especially some of mine. So
Yeah, I was going to say greed and envy. The 7 deadly sins, basically.
Yeah, right. There you go. Let's
Gluttony,
just go down.
gluttony.
Pride.
Yeah. I got a novel in progress that involves lust, so yeah.
Yep. Yeah. All of those things line up, but it's all fear driven or selfish driven, in the antagonist.
If somebody were to say to you, I want to know how you write a villain, who would you point to, and why would you point to them? What is it about them that you want people to kind of gravitate on or hold on to?
I give the example of the Nightmare Crow from my Saga of the Outer Islands, because he starts off as, this typical shadowy villain pulling the puppet strings of other people, right? But as the series goes on, you understand his motivation, you understand what's happened to him, you understand the obsessive nature of why he's doing all this, until the end, and it all explodes and things happen. So that's the kind of the evolution that I point to of how I write the villain.
I mentioned him earlier. In my book Vengeance, I had a couple antagonists, but the first one was Charlie Wisnowski. Yes, that was the name of my drug lord. And he was likable in that he looked after his people who were loyal, but he had no qualms killing people who weren't, or torturing people for information. It was tough for my antagonist to bring him down after working for him for so long, to understand him, because he was, layered in all of these different things. And, having that ambiguity of whether is he good, is he not, is he, the serial killer that my guy's looking after, as well as the crook in the drug ring, so it was great to have that ambiguity.
I do is I make a toxic cocktail, mix about 3 or 4 people in, and then I evolve him into his own person. But my latest one is a little bit of Jack Ripper, a little bit of Robert Pickton, a little bit of Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, and finally a little bit of Peter Steele, who was the lead singer of a gothic metal band in the late 90s called Type O Negative, because he goes after Type O Negative blood. So
the one I will talk about is the one from the Empire of Ruin series. So he's called Nexus Almor, and he is the master of war for this empire called the Hautveltian Empire. And he's kind of like the second in command. He is the head of the armies for the emperor, and he's the childhood friend of the emperor. And he's in the first book a little bit, and he comes across very, very kind of villainous. He's very pro what the emperor is trying to do, and he's all on board with it. And he has a scene where he murders one of the main characters, basically for information, and shows no remorse for it or anything like that. And then just the last scene that we see of him, there's a little, I try and work in a little seed of doubt where he's talking to the emperor, and the emperor says something and likens him to a slave, basically, and he walks out thinking, is this how he thinks of me? Like, am I just disposable like everyone else? I thought I was more than this. So in the second book, which it's not out yet, it's out for a few months, but he's in it quite a lot more, and he's on a campaign, and he is very kind of traditional in the way that how he would conduct the art of war, and the emperor is insisting on a different type of weapon, I suppose, and it's something that he fears from something that's happened in his past. And it's kind of like a descent into madness with his storyline as it's going on. And what's interesting about that is he becomes very, very kind of paranoid, and he's doing stuff to other people, and he's doing stuff to himself. And he has these fears that are coming out about what, all stemming from this line from what he thinks the emperor is person that he's put on this pedestal for forever has said about him, and his worst fears may possibly come true, and he may be proven right by the end of the story. And then we will see where he takes this knowledge into the next book.